All right, so this video is part 5. We're just going to review everything we've done so far. A lot of, what I'm doing is basically, fumbling around trying to figure out how to use Rails correctly. And I know in the process, it's probably difficult to follow. So this is going to be a video basically to describe all of the steps. The first thing we're going to do is run Rails New Game Arena to basically initialize a Rails project. Then we want to go into the Game Arena directory or whatever you called the project. And the first thing we're going to do is run Rails generate scaffold. And then we're going to have a model name room. And it's going to have an attribute of name, which is going to be a string data type. Then we're going to open it in VS Code or whatever your text editor is. And we go to DB migrate and then create rooms. Note that Rails generate scaffold basically generates a bunch of code, but it doesn't actually run any of it. So here we can just modify the code a little bit before we run it. Then after that, we can actually run the code by doing rake db migrate, and that will basically run all of your migration files. At the moment, we only have one. And that basically adds the room model to the database. And if you look at our schema, you can see all of the tables that we have in our database right now. Again, we only have one. But you would go through the same process if you wanted to add a bunch of models, which can kind of be thought of synonymously with tables. The next thing I want to do is go to the routes file, and we're going to uncomment this. And we're going to change this to rooms index. I also want to get the Tailwind CDN, so I'm just going to copy this right here. And if I go into application.html, I can paste in that code and it will basically make Tailwind available all throughout the application because this code is on the outside of every single view that we look at. So now we can run Rails server to start up the server, and that will let us go to localhost 3000. And you can see here that our homepage is that index of rooms. So if we create a new room, we can call it whatever we want to. Go back to rooms. I'm going to create one more room and call it room number 2. Create that room. Go back to rooms. And that page that we were just looking at is this one index.html. So we can add in a turbo frame tag and call it, rooms do end. If I indent all this, we also want to go to new.html and basically copy that tag because when we click on the link, new room path, that's going to take us to new.html and it's going to look for a matching turbo frame tag and basically inject all of this HTML into this turbo frame here. So now if I refresh and I click on new room, you can see that it basically replaced everything with this form. If I go back to rooms, I'm back at my index.html view. Here I'm going to add in another turbo frame ID. This is going to be called room form for now. We're going to add in some CSS. And I'm basically going to take this link to the form and I'm going to put it in this turbo frame. Although remember, we're going to want a matching turbo frame on new.html. So this is actually going to be room form. That way, when I click on the new link, it will basically take that form and put it in here and I can still see all of my rooms. Let me get rid of this ID, add some CSS. And you can basically see now when I click on the new room, we have our form here, but we can still see all of our rooms. Now I'm going to add another turbo frame here. ID of room list class. We'll move all of this into that turbo frame and we'll move this link here into the actual render of room. So we go to room.html. We can paste that here. I don't really need the paragraph tags. Let me just add in a little CSS here. One thing I want to do is take this code right here and basically move it into its own partial. I'm going to go ahead and create a new file called attributes.html.erb. It can be called anything you want, just make sure you have the underscore at the beginning there. And here we're going to paste that way in room.html. We can call render, and then we can just render attributes. And then we need to pass it the room, which is going to be room. I'm going to copy this line of code and also put it in our show.html and replace the render room. That way it only renders the attributes there and it doesn't render this, link. And just so you know, when we're rendering attributes, it knows automatically that we are currently in the rooms folder because this file underscore room is in the rooms folder. If I wanted to render a partial in a different folder, like if I had another view, like for example, if I had a partial under layouts, then I would need to include that part of the path where it says layouts and then / attributes. But for now, we'll leave that as it is. Here I'm going to add in a turbo frame, give it the ID of room controls, and then room.id, but this is Ruby code. So we're going to need to wrap that, and then we're going to close out that turbo frame. For now, I'm going to get rid of this ID and then add in a little more CSS. And we are going to want a matching turbo frame ID here when we go to show.html. So we will add that in here. Class for now. We're going to want to close out that tag. Keeping in mind that the context that was generated by the scaffold is referring to at room instead of room, so we'll add that in here. And I wasn't fully sure why there was this difference. I'm still not 100% sure, but I think when we see the at symbol, it's actually referencing grabbing the instance of the room from a controller. So here when we call the show function, it calls set room, and then we set that room, and we now have access to that inside of the view. Whereas if you don't see that at symbol, the room variable, I believe, is coming from some other source, like, for example, this render where we're passing it that room. And you can see that this room is not an at symbol because this room came from index. That's also coming from a render, but referring to each individual room in rooms, and rooms is coming from a controller, which you can see at index where we're referencing at rooms is equal to room all. And while I'm not 100% sure that that's always correct, it's something to think about. Maybe when we see, a room, we can always trace it back to the original source where it's being rendered in a controller. Speaking of which, I've noticed that in my show.html, this right here should be an at symbol. I did notice I also have a typo here. And in show.html, I want to add in a div here just to modify some of the CSS. And we'll give this an ID, DOM ID, referencing that individual instance of the room. Modify some CSS here. And I have a typo here. And so now if we look at our home page, we click on show this room, we go to back to rooms, everything looks to be okay. So click on new room. I do want to add some styling to the form. So that's in new.html. That'll be in form.html. We can add in class. And I'll add a little bit of padding around the entire application. So now if I click new room, this looks okay. Create room. Now we don't want this to redirect us to a new page here, so let's go back to rooms. And the reason it's doing that is because it hits the create controller, and you can see here it redirects to the room URL. But what we really want is for it to redirect to the room's path, which if you open the Rails console and type Rails routes, you can see that room's path will take you to index.html. So refresh, new room, create another room here. And nothing actually happens, but if you refresh, you can see that the room gets added to the page. Now, we would like for that to happen kind of in real time, and I had some trouble with this, but hopefully now I have a solution. If we go to after create commit, then we can broadcast append to, and then we need to name a stream. It doesn't really matter what it is, but I'm going to call it rooms. Then we're going to want to declare a partial here, which is going to be the partial that's getting rendered. So that's going to be rooms/room. And then here we have our locals, and we're going to say that the room is going to be self, and the target is going to be room list. So let's stop and talk about this real quick. This is a callback function basically saying after we create a room, call this function, and we're going to broadcast the append, which means that we're going to be adding to the DOM a partial, and it says to go to the folder rooms and then find the room.html, which is this file here that we have. And then we're going to render this template using the instance of the room that triggered this callback function. And then finally, we're going to target room list, which is in index.html. This is that turbo frame here. We're going to target it, and we're going to try to append this, room.html with the instance of the room to this turbo frame. Although you can see here we have broadcast append to rooms, but we actually need to add in a turbo stream from. And then here we can call this room. I think one of the things that was giving me trouble when I was playing around with the syntax and kind of testing everything out was that if you make any changes to this, you have to restart your Rails server. So we're gonna, restart the Rails server. I also need to go into Game Arena with a Redis server. I actually tried this out on my Mac, and I don't need to do this on my Mac. So not everybody is gonna have to do this, but if you have Windows like I do, you might need to try this out. But now I'm going to go back into the folder. I'm going to open up the Rails console. And what I'm going to try to do is create a room console. There is one thing that's a little bit annoying. In room.html and show.html, in order to access the attributes partial, we actually have to add in the file path. And I think it's because when we actually create the room, it seems to lose track of the context that basically says, hey, this room.html file is in the rooms folder, so we need to render the attributes in this same folder. But if you try that using this callback function, it throws an error. So if you add that in, it should hopefully work. So now if I go into Rails console and I try to create a room, you can see that it actually gets appended immediately to the DOM. And that's because we're using action cable, which is listening for every creation of the room. And anybody subscribed to the stream, which in this case is anybody looking at the localhost rooms index, will basically be receiving from that stream. And that code is coming from index.html. You can see here we have turbo stream from rooms. And I just want to double check to see if I could modify the name of this to something different. So instead of rooms, I'd rather call it room stream. And then we go here, we would have to call this room stream as well. Basically saying that when we append, we're broadcasting that creation to anybody subscribed to that stream. But keep in mind, because I just made a modification here to the room.model, I'm going to have to restart my server. To be safe, I'm going to go ahead and restart my Redis server as well. So now if I try to create another room in the console, cool, we see that it gets appended to the DOM, and we don't have to just do it in the console. We can do it here as well. Call it anything you want, create the room, bam, it gets added to the DOM. Now I kind of like this method. There's actually another way to do this. Let me go ahead and comment that out so that code is not being run anymore. And if I go to rooms controller, the other thing we can do is after we create a new room, we know that we're going to be hitting this function. It tries to save the room here. And if it does that successfully, we can do format.turbostream. So we can do format.turbostream, render turbostream append. And we have a lot of the same arguments. So I'll copy most of them. The difference is this is not going to be a stream. This is going to be an AJAX request. So I believe it'll be a little bit slower. Rather than room stream, what we're going to do is we're going to put the target here in the first argument. Get rid of that brace. And this would be room list rather than room stream. We're still referencing the same partial, and then the locals here, the room is going to be this instance of a room that we have up here, the one that we just saved here in the database. And it's basically doing the same thing, saying after, the room gets created, then we want to go to index.html, find the room list, and append that room to the DOM. So we don't need turbo stream from here because this is not going to be a WebSocket. And let's try it out. Method number 2, create. And it still does the same thing. So if we go to inspect and we look at the network, when we create a new room, room number 4, and we click on create, we're receiving, it's basically going to append all of this stuff to the target of room list. And it's basically going to append everything inside of this template tag to the element room list. So that's cool. Let me click on new room. Notice that when I create a room, the form is still here. Now we could do something like use stimulus to clear out the field, and we'll definitely get into something like that later. But another thing we could do is use turbo streams. We could do 2 different turbo streams rather than doing only one thing. However, the creator of Rails has suggested if you're going to do that, then you're going to want to use the third method of doing turbo streams. And basically for that, we're going to go ahead and get rid of all of this here. You're still going to leave format.turbostream, but then we're going to create a view, which I'm really not a fan of this method because in my mind, this is not, an HTML template, which is what I associate views with being, or at least in my mind. But this is, the way that the creator of Rails recommends doing it if you're going to have, multiple turbo streams. And this is a valid way of doing it even if you only want to do one turbo stream. We can create a create.turbostream.erb. And here we can do turbostream.append. A lot of the arguments are kind of the same, so we'll copy and paste that. We are appending room list with the partial of rooms /rooms, and we're using the same local here. And this @room here is coming from the rooms controller as well. Rails basically knows that, we're creating something, and it calls the create turbo stream, and then it renders this particular view, and then let's double check to make sure that that is working the way that we intended it to. So if I type in method 3, create room, all right, it still does the same thing. And this method is still using AJAX. The only one that uses WebSockets is the broadcast method. But you can see here we still have our form here, and that is inside of this room form turbo frame. So instead of this, what we could do is turbo stream remove room form So what we could do is turbo stream update, and then here we would do room form, and we can pass it an empty string. So now if we go back and create another room, it creates the room the way that we expect it to, but then, you see that the room is no longer there. Now that example isn't super useful in this context because it just removes the link to create a new room, but I just wanted to demonstrate that that is a thing that you could do. I'm going to try to avoid doing this method. I just don't like it. I don't like the idea of having a view dedicated to something that isn't, directly an HTML template. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete that. You can use either of these two methods. I'm going to try to, for the most part, try to use the broadcast method. I kind of like that one. It feels a little bit cleaner, and it's faster to my understanding. So we can get rid of the turbo stream here, and we can uncomment this information here. We do need to go into index.html, re-add that stream from. And keep in mind you need to restart the server. Let me try one time just to make sure it's working. All right, everything looks good. And for the record, you can see even in the Rails log, turbo streams channel, and it has pretty much, the HTML that's, getting sent over the wire, where we're appending the room list with this turbo frame or the whole template, which is inside of room.html.erb. Now I want to do the same thing here, but I'm going to do after destroy commit, and then we can do broadcast remove to, and this is going to be the same room stream. Let's figure out real quick what it is we're trying to remove. If I inspect, I can see that what I want to remove is the room controls. So we have room controls 19, 18, 11, the individual instance, and I want to remove that turbo frame. So hopefully this will work. Target, we don't need to include, the locals of the partial here, but we do need to have a target, which is going to be room controls. And then here we'll have the self.id. Again, let me restart my Rails server. And if we click on show this room, destroy the room. All right, the room is now gone. Show, destroy. It does look like it's doing a full refresh. I don't think I need that. I'm assuming that if I look at I'm assuming that's because in the rooms controller, it is doing this redirect, but I don't think I need this at all because all we're doing is basically removing that item from the DOM. So if we just remove this all together and refresh, now when we delete the room, it appears to be working all right. Now when we, click on a room and then we delete it, all right, it looks like it doesn't fully show us what's going on, but it does remove the item from the DOM. If you look in your Rails log, you can see that it calls the remove action on the target of room controls 25, but it doesn't, cause a redirect of the page. I did notice that in the log, when we delete something, we did get a message, no template found, rendering head, no content. I assume this would just be a better practice if we just added in head OK. This basically just says render a status of 200, basically saying that everything is as we expect it to be. But now if I, create a room and then destroy it, in the log we can see we have a completed 200 OK. It doesn't really make a difference in the function of the application, but it's probably a better practice. Anyway, that is the end of this video for now. We will continue moving forward. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this content at all useful. And thanks for watching.